Good evening, you're watching World News Tonight on TVP World. I'm Aaron Darman. Brussels is again walking a balancing act tonight as it ramps up pressure on the Kremlin just days after Donald Trump urged Europe to do more to squeeze Russia. More in just a moment. First, the latest headlines. The Polish Armed Forces stages its largest military drills of the year as Russia's Zapad exercises come to an end. Romania's ex-presidential candidate is charged with a coup attempt. And the wife of late Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny says he was poisoned by the Kremlin. The European Union appears to be listening to US President Donald Trump's calls for the continent to further crack down on the Russian war machine, as well as preparing a 19th sanctions package. Reports now emerging that Brussels could use frozen assets from Moscow to fund the fight in Ukraine. Let's go live to the Belgian capital now, where our EU correspondent Angela Scoogens is standing by. Good evening, Angela. What more can you tell us?
Good evening, Aaron. So the latest news is that the European Commission reportedly is mulling whether to use 170 billion euros worth of frozen Russian state assets currently held in Europe to fund Ukraine's war efforts. Now, the Financial Times newspaper is reporting that the EU executive is mulling this idea, exploring it in two proposals, the first of which using the cash balances of some of this money currently held in financial institution Euroclear in Belgium to purchase a zero-interest EU bonds, the proceeds of which will then be given to Ukraine in tranches. The second option being creating a special purpose vehicle so non-EU member states can participate. But if both of these proposals go from just being proposals into concrete action, it could seriously shift the dial in Ukraine's favour, also sending a strong message to Moscow, also Washington, that the EU is willing to play ball. Now, these reports come off the back of European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen speaking with US President Donald Trump late last night. In a post on social media platform X, the EU executive chief stated that both of these leaders spoke about ramping up joint efforts to put the economic squeeze onto Russian President Vladimir Putin. From the EU side, this is expected to be manifested through the 19th sanctions package, which is expected to be handed down, proposed any day now. But according to that statement, the EU is looking at hitting Russia's crypto banking and energy sectors much harder, with a particular carve-out for phasing out Russian energy imports in particular. This is clearly a response to US President Donald Trump stating last week that NATO allies must stop purchasing Russian energy. If and only when this happens, the US will impose sanctions onto Russia. But there was other energy news here in the Belgian capital today. The EU announced that it has proposed the blueprint of a plan to beef up relations with India, but the High Representative Kaja Kallas said that she was cognizant of certain obstacles that stood in the way of this bilateral relationship from getting stronger, particularly India's imports of Russian energy. So it'll be interesting to see how Washington reacts to these overtures from Brussels, particularly as officials in the Oval Office on Friday called on G7 alliance members as well as EU member states to impose tariffs onto China and India. But hopefully all of this will be laid bare when and if that 19th sanctions package hits the ground running, hopefully soon, as well as when we hear reaction from US President Donald Trump.
Angela Scoogens in Brussels, thank you. And as Europe thrashes out a response to Donald Trump, the US President has touched down in the United Kingdom for a historic second state visit. Formally, he's been greeted with pomp and ceremony, but others aren't so happy about Trump's trip, slamming his murky past with convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. Sonia Agata-Bischan explains.
The Marine One helicopter touching down at Windsor Castle. That marked the beginning of US President Donald Trump's historic second state visit to the United Kingdom. Historic because no US president or any other leader has ever had a second visit. To some, this handshake is a symbol of partnership between the two nations.
No one can change the UK and US relationship. It's going to be there forever.
Others were more critical of the meeting, with some protesting Trump's visit altogether, holding banners referencing various political issues Trump has engaged in.
We're holding this demonstration today because we want to give a space to the vast majority of British people to make their feelings known about the fact that they hate Donald Trump. They hate his politics, they hate his racism, the fact that he's a rapist, the fact that he is enabling a genocide in Gaza, the fact that he's cozying up to Putin.
4 people were even arrested, having displayed images onto the Windsor Castle of Trump with convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein, whom Trump has long sought to distance himself from, despite indications of an earlier friendship.
He don't care for protocol, he don't care for the kings, he don't care for the government, he don't care for the United States, he don't care for anything apart from himself.
But whether or not Trump cares for royal pageantry, he was welcomed with a carriage procession and ceremonial honor guard, a manner which upset the protesters all the more.
We also want to tell our government that the way they're behaving towards Trump, it reflects their total lack of spine, their lack of vision, their complete failure to stand up for Britain and give us something to be proud of.
Following a day with the royal family, Donald Trump will meet with British Prime Minister Keir Starmer on Thursday.
And together we got a deal.
Their talks are expected to focus on investment, tariffs, ending Russia's war in Ukraine, and the situation in Gaza. For TVP World, I'm Sonia Gatabishchan.
Mr. President.
Russia and Belarus have wrapped up their joint Zapad military drills near Poland's border, with international observers present for the first time. It comes as Warsaw remains on high alert after last week's drone incursion into Polish airspace, holding its own exercises and keeping the line of contact with Belarus closed until further notice. Anastasia Yanchenko reports.
The eyes of the whole world were on this year's Russian-Belarusian Zapad military exercises, and not just figuratively. NATO observers, including from the US, were invited to spectate. However, compared to 2021, when around 200,000 personnel were involved, this year's drills included only about 13,000 Russian and Belarusian troops, a much smaller force.
Russia is experiencing an acute shortage of both manpower and military equipment due to the active phase of war in Ukraine. As much as it would like to showcase its scale, it can't afford to divert troops and hardware simply for the sake of holding exercises under such conditions.
Along with shortages of military personnel, there are also issues with equipment. Videos posted by the Russian military showed their inflatable jets visibly sagging. However, experts still take it seriously, as it could be a Russian disguise.
There's no need to get overly excited or sarcastic about them having rubber planes or rubber tanks. These are just standard mock-ups used by armies worldwide to deceive the enemy.
Despite the smaller force, this year's Zapad drills still drew the attention of NATO and especially Poland. Due to the high risk of provocation from the east, Poland closed all border crossings with Belarus. Just one day before the start of the drills, Russia launched a massive drone incursion into Poland through Belarusian territory. Due to this provocation, the border is to remain closed until further notice.
They've done this stunt with the drones and they've run this exercise. And what are you finding out? Oh, okay, now NATO countries are discussing that they seriously are thinking about how to close the skies over Ukraine.
While the Zapad drills were underway, NATO launched its largest exercises in Poland, Iron Defender. The operation deployed 30,000 Polish and Western troops to Belarus and Kaliningrad borders and included allied air patrols to demonstrate readiness to respond to Russia.
Everything depends on how well the different NATO allies, how much they've trained together, how much they've exercised together.
This report for TVP World, Anastasia Yanchenko.
The wife of Alexei Navalny says biological samples show the late Russian opposition leader was poisoned by the Kremlin. Navalny died suddenly earlier this year, with Moscow denying he was killed while imprisoned in a penal colony near the Arctic Circle. Alex Sumlinsky and Jan Kennedy report.
My husband, Alexei Navalny, was poisoned,
said Yulia Navalny, the late opposition leader's wife, citing evidence from foreign laboratory tests of her deceased husband's biological samples. In a video posted on X, Navalny claims that Navalny's biological material was smuggled abroad in 2024 and examined by 2 laboratories.
In February 2024, we were able to obtain samples of Alexei's biological material and securely smuggle them abroad. Labs in at least 2 countries examined these samples independently of each other, and these labs in 2 different countries reached the same conclusion: Alexei was killed. More specifically, he was poisoned.
However, she did not specify what poison was found in her late husband's body. She now demands that the laboratories make their findings public.
Alexei was my husband. He was my friend. He was a symbol of hope for our country. Putin killed that hope. We have the right to know how he did it. I demand that the labs that conducted the analysis publish their results.
Alexei Navalny, Russia's most popular opposition figure, died suddenly in a Russian prison in the Arctic Circle last February. Navalny was imprisoned in what is known as the Polar Wolf Colony, considered one of the toughest prisons in Russia. In a newly published video, Navalny described her husband's last moments. She also shared a photo claiming it showed the cell in which he spent his final hours, with vomit visible on the floor. Since his death, she has taken on the task of carrying forward her husband's legacy, vowing to push for democratic change in Russia.
Putin must answer for what he has done with my country. Putin must answer for what he has done to a neighboring peaceful country. And Putin must answer for everything he has done to Alexei.
Yulia Navalny and world leaders, including then US President Joe Biden and European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, blamed Putin for Navalny's death. However, the Kremlin dismissed the claims.
Romanian prosecutors have charged Călin Georgescu, the far-right politician and once presidential hopeful, to stand trial, charging him with an attempted coup d'etat. At the same time, authorities confirm Russian interference was detected during the last presidential election campaign, an issue its neighbour Moldova is also grappling with. Balkans correspondent Paweł Trzaskowski has more.
His political retirement is over. Călin Georgescu, the highly controversial candidate in last year's presidential election in Romania, is back, but probably not the way he imagined it. Georgescu was the surprising winner of the first round of the election, but the vote was annulled by the country's top court, citing foreign malign interference, supposedly promoting Georgescu, who now, along with some of his supporters, is being charged with attempting to stage violent protests following the court's decision.
22 defendants were sent to trial for attempting efforts against the constitutional order, public incitement, and some of them for violating weapons, ammunition or explosive statutes.
According to Georgescu, the indictment is a made-up case.
The case, or the indictment to be more precise, is just narrative. That's all.
But the case also marks an important milestone, as along with the indictment, Romania has openly acknowledged Russian interference in the electoral process.
We have identified a large-scale network of sites with web traffic created by commercials, most of them promoted by 4 companies related to the Russian Federation. The more dangerous attacks, especially those of ransomware type, were wholly associated with pro-Russian groups.
Russian influence in the region is not limited to Romania, though. Neighboring Moldova has been struggling with interference from Moscow ever since the country became independent from the Soviet Union. And now, as the country gears up for general elections at the end of September, it's only intensified. A recent report by the Promo-Lex election observation mission shows that an army of fake online accounts coordinated by the Russian Federation, alongside other means, has been used to influence the outcome of the vote.
The volume of interference, the massiveness of investments of the Russian Federation to curb the direction for the development of Republic of Moldova is impressive.
During last year's presidential election, approximately 140,000 votes were corrupted by the Kremlin.
So votes are effectively being bought with Russian money.
This was the problem in 2024 elections. It seems to be a problem now too.
There are now 22 political entities in the electoral race in Moldova, some of them with connections to the Kremlin. The September 28th general elections will present a parliament that will decide the future path of the country, which has been on a steady pro-European course for 4 years now. An effort that could be derailed if pro-Russian forces find their way to the new parliament. Paweł Trzaskowski for TVP World.
High hopes for Poland's export industry despite increasing economic headwinds. As Maciej Wylowski reports, the country's exports were tracked up almost 500 billion euros last year, is spread across different sectors, helping shield it from Donald Trump's trade war.
Polish exports are holding up despite global trade headwinds. Poland's exports of goods and services totaled $479 billion last year. That places Poland 21st in the world by value of exports, just ahead of Russia and just behind Taiwan. Some of Poland's biggest export items include car parts and accessories, electronic equipment, furniture, and food products. Poland has also emerged as a hub for the production of lithium-ion batteries, a key component used in electric vehicles worldwide. Compared to neighboring countries, Poland's exports are quite diversified, with no individual sector having a more than 10% share.
As compared to other countries, it is very, very, very diversified structure, and it is what This is what makes Polish economy resilient. Yeah? So to some crises. Yeah. So we always have some part of Polish exports which is performing quite well.
While most of Poland's exports are goods or finished products, trade and services plays an equally important role.
Polish export and import of goods is more or less balanced. It is huge, but it is balanced. But on export of service, which is smaller, we generate huge surplus, huge trade surplus.
Most of Poland's exports, about 4/5 of the total, go to European Union countries. Germany is by far Poland's biggest individual trade partner, with 27% of Polish exports heading to its western neighbor as of 2024. The US, which earlier this year imposed extensive tariffs on EU countries, accounted for just 3.3% of the dollar value of Polish exports. That could shield Poland from the worst effects of Donald Trump's trade war. Poland's dynamic and diversified trade structure could help its economy outcompete in these uncertain times. For TVP World, I'm Maciej Wylowski.
We return now to our top story, Europe's manoeuvring on Russia and what Donald Trump could do next. Joining me for more is Scott Lucas, Professor of American Studies at the University College Dublin. Good evening, sir.
Very good evening to you and your viewers.
So President Donald Trump pumping the pressure on Europe to stop buying Russian oil. Is he just using that as an excuse to delay America's own sanctions and effectively put the ball in the court of Russia-friendly Hungary, Slovakia?
I do think that Donald Trump is using it in part so he doesn't have to face the difficult decision, because it's like you first, right? Now, we already know that the European Union is planning to phase out Russian oil and gas exports by the end of 2027. But as you rightly know, and somewhat ironically, it's Trump-friendly leaders and Putin-friendly leaders, Robert Fico in Slovakia, Viktor Orban in Hungary, that could hold that up. So in a sense, Trump is kind of hiding behind them. In another sense, this goes beyond calculation. This is just simply Donald Trump hating to make any type of investment that isn't one where he sees a quick profit. your viewers will long know that he has always blamed Europe for ripping off the United States, for Europe doing bad trade deals with the United States, Europe relying on U.S. military funding. And so that idea is if there's a sacrifice to be made, a cost to be incurred through sanctions, Europe should pay that cost first before the U.S.
On the flip side, is there an argument to be made that we're seeing Trump's effective diplomacy? I mean, since coming into office, he's pushed NATO members to ramp up defence spending. He's now pushing the EU to get rid of Russian oil. Is Donald Trump exactly what Brussels needs to get moving?
Well, I mean, on the wider question, I mean, look, long before Donald Trump, this question of EU members ramping up their defense spending was on the table. In 2014, during the Obama presidency, that commitment was made at a NATO meeting in Wales to get to 2% of GDP. The reason why it has accelerated this year in terms of defense spending is not because of an alliance with Donald Trump. It's because of a fear that Donald Trump's going to walk away from the alliance. In other words, given Trump's chaotic, unpredictable behavior, his threatening behavior to step aside, EU countries and other countries in NATO have got to take care of themselves. So perversely, Trump has contributed to it, but not in the sense of a very organized, cooperative way. The broader issue, and I think it's important beyond Trump, is what's happening with Trump's officials. Now, there are some officials, such as J.D. Vance, the vice president, such as the supposed envoy Steve Witkoff, the real estate developer, who are very skeptical about working with Europe. We know that. But behind the scenes, what has happened in recent weeks, indeed months, is there are some U.S. officials who are working with Europe and Ukraine on these questions of sanctions and on this question of security. And the big issue here is, can they advance the proposals to a point where they can put them before Trump and, I hate to say it, but almost manipulate him into seeing this as being the best way forward, rather than retreating into the idea that Vladimir Zelensky is to blame and maybe Vladimir Putin isn't so bad a guy.
So do you feel like Donald Trump, but also his administration and perhaps their ultimatums, are sharpening the mind of those in Brussels, forcing their hand?
Oh, look, the EU, NATO, individual countries, including Poland, their minds were sharpened on January 20th, 2025, when Donald Trump became the 47th president of the United States. I fully expected, many analysts expected, that the Trump administration would completely walk away from Europe and from Ukraine. And our fears appeared to be justified, if you remember, in February at the Munich Security Conference, when J.D. Vance just stood up there and insulted Europe and effectively said there's no reason for the U.S. to be involved in European security. What happened at that point, so we're talking 7 months ago, is that European leaders, including Poland's leaders, NATO's leaders, worked with Ukraine to try to maneuver Trump and maneuver the officials. Now, that was sidetracked a bit by the public humiliation of Vladimir Zelensky in the White House, we remember at the end of February, but Ukraine and Europe kept pushing ahead because the original plan was that Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin would get a, quote, deal they could just impose on everybody. The reason why Ukraine and Europe were able to maneuver and to actually prevent that happening is because Putin overplayed his hand. He didn't give terms that were going to be acceptable to anybody, and he kept on bombing Ukraine civilians. So I'd have to say again, it's not Trump's ultimatum, because Trump just spins like a weather vane. He threatens one day, he asks for cooperation the next. It was that continuity of planning that had to be provided by Ukraine and by Europe, and to find the adults in the room in Washington.
You mentioned the Munich Security Conference there. I remember I was there, remember J.D. Vance's speech well, and it coming as such a shock to the leaders, and then heading to Paris because they held an emergency summit off the back of that. So a very interesting time back in February for the transatlantic relationship, and I'm interested in how you see the transatlantic ties now. Where do things stand between Brussels and Washington as we speak?
Well, there's a more recent story, which is after the red carpet treatment for Vladimir Putin on August 15th. 3 days later, Brussels, European Union, NATO leaders, Vladimir Zelensky ensured that 7 European leaders plus Zelensky got to Washington to keep the U.S. on board. And we've had confirmation this week that the U.S. has now transferred, or I should say sold, the first tranche of military aid under the new arrangements, which is NATO members buy the assistance and then they send it to Ukraine. That is a very important practical step. But the broad answer I'd give you here is the type of transatlantic relationship that we had from the end of World War II that developed through the Cold War, beyond the Cold War, whatever its ups and downs, that relationship is not what we have now. U.S. administrations, whether you agree or disagree with them, they followed the rules of the game in terms of an alliance. Donald Trump doesn't believe in an alliance. Donald Trump believes in what he can get out of this. And the secret here is not to treat him as an ally in return, but to try to manipulate him and to play him in that you can keep your alliance going with the U.S. agencies, the military, the intelligence services, the State Department. And we're seeing another example of that today. It just happens to be the UK in the lead by flattering Trump, by saying nice things, by giving him the pomp and the pageantry so that he goes back home feeling good about the UK's request that the US continue to support Ukraine.
But I'm interested, actually, does that flattery work, or is it, shall we say, a short-term psychological hit? He goes back, he thinks, oh yeah, the UK is pretty great, but then a week later when it comes to decision-making, it falls flat. Or do you think flattery is effective with Donald Trump?
You just have to keep doing it. I don't like the fact you have to keep doing it. I would prefer this to be an adult approach based on a meeting of national interest, not on Trump's personal interest, but just this is just the world that we're in. I think the issue here is that in this competition to flatter Trump, the Russians may have run out of options. I mean, they gave him that face-to-face with Vladimir Putin. How much further could they go? Possibly an invitation to Moscow for a summit. And in the meantime, you just keep working on him through certain officials. Keith Kellogg, the envoy to Ukraine, is one. Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, is another. To an extent, Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, who get in there and say, Mr. President, Vladimir Putin isn't going to cease fire. He's not going to give you that Nobel Peace Prize. He's not going to stop. Your only alternative is to support others in making sure that he can't overrun Ukraine. And then you have to do it again the next week. And the week after that, it gets to be a bit of a Groundhog's Day. But the fact here is that in a conflict which is going to threaten Ukraine's and European security for months or even years, that day by day, week by week flattery is essential at this point, and probably until Donald Trump is no longer president.
While I have you, I'm interested on Europe's position and the European Union, which itself is juggling a number of balls in the air, because just today sort of eyeing deeper ties with India, despite India's links with Russia, keeping clear air with China, despite China's links with Russia, and trying to stay all smiles with Donald Trump. So my question to you, is the EU being a people pleaser?
No, I think the EU is actually dealing with a Trumpian world very effectively here. And I think the India case is an interesting one, because I do a lot of work with Indian TV channels. And I can tell you the Indian government, Indian society is furious with the Trump administration because they thought they had a trade deal with the Americans. And because they didn't flatter Trump in April, because they didn't say, oh, thank you for stopping our confrontation with Pakistan, he got upset and slapped 50% tariffs on them. So at that point, what does India do? India confirmed a historic trade agreement with the UK, and now the EU and India have an opportunity for their own trade agreement. This is a way of working in a world where the US is not necessarily at the center of your calculations because you can't rely on them. So what do you have to do? You have to work with others. And in this case, the EU and India, I think, is a very, very good fit, especially because it's much more problematic for the EU to try to get on the right side of China for that type of agreement.
Lastly, if Europe commits to change, for example, slashing the use of Russian oil or using billions of Russia's frozen assets to fund Ukraine, do you believe Washington will practice what it preaches and slam Putin finally with those extra sanctions?
Depends on the adults in the room. I mean, and this is what makes it difficult as an analyst. It's what makes it difficult for you all as journalists. You've got to watch not just Donald Trump. You've got to watch the other people who are in play here. So I'm going to be watching, for example, Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, the envoy Steve Witkoff. All of them are in alongside Trump in the UK today. What type of statements do they make? And let me give you one example. Donald Trump dropped the idea of sanctions on Russia when he met Vladimir Putin in Alaska. Putin played him. The people who put the idea of sanctions back on the table, albeit, of course, Europe goes first. Who were they? It wasn't Trump. It was the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, and then the Energy Secretary, Chris Wright. Just as I said, Europe's got to keep working on this day to day. So the Trump administrations have got to work on this on day to day and hope they don't run into objections, not just from Trump, but from someone like J.D. Vance, who, of course, has his big ambition, which is to be president in 2029.
Scott Lucas, Professor of American Studies at the University College Dublin. Always a pleasure. Thank you again for your time.
Thanks to you and your great viewers.
And that's all for World News Tonight. Do stay with us here on TVP World. I'm Aaron Darman. Good night.